Flight 305, a routine trip, New York to Los Angeles, hundreds of souls aboard, unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. Among them, Sarah, a seasoned flight attendant. Her friendly smile masked a steely resolve. Little did she know this flight would test her courage like never before. Sarah, ever vigilant, made her rounds. Her gaze fell upon two men seated in business class. Their conversation, though muffled, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The galley, a confined space bustling with activity, became Sarah's sanctuary. The two men approached the galley. Sarah pretended to be engrossed in her tasks, her heart pounding in her chest. They spoke of a package, a deadline, and a plan. Each word felt heavy with implication, fueling Sarah's growing unease. Her hand instinctively went to her pocket, her fingers brushing against the small, voice-activated recorder she always carried. Sarah knew she had to act, and she had to act fast. The fate of the flight and everyone on board might very well depend on it. The recorder felt cold and heavy in Sarah's palm. With practiced movements, Sarah slipped the recorder into an inconspicuous crevice behind a panel in the galley. Its red light blinked, a silent sentinel recording every word. Taking a deep breath, Sarah schooled her features into an expression of calm. She resumed her duties, her every movement measured, her senses on high alert. She had a lead, a thread to follow, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. Every nerve in Sarah's body thrummed with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Back in the galley, the recorder continued its silent vigil. Maintaining a facade of normalcy, Sarah continued her duties. As the flight progressed, Sarah began to piece together fragments of information. She eavesdropped on conversations, her ears straining to pick up any mention of the two men or their plans. She studied the passengers, searching for any unusual behavior. During a brief lull in service, Sarah retreated to the galley, her heart pounding in her chest. She carefully retrieved the recorder, her fingers trembling slightly as she pressed the playback button. The voices of the two men filled the small space, their words sending chills down her spine. "The package must be delivered on time," one voice hissed. "There can be no mistakes," the other voice replied. The gravity of the situation crashed over Sarah like a tidal wave. She knew she couldn't stay silent, couldn't ignore the danger that loomed over the passengers entrusted to her care. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Sarah made her way through the darkened cabin, she collided with a solid figure. It was him, one of the men from the galley, his face now inches from hers. "You all right there, miss?" he asked, his voice smooth, but his eyes held a glint of steel. Yes, I'm fine," Sarah stammered, her heart racing in her chest. He reached out a hand to steady her, his touch lingering for a moment too long. "Well, you be careful now," he said, his voice low and menacing. With a curt nod, Sarah hurried away, her mind racing. He knew. She was being watched, hunted. The announcement crackled through the cabin, the captain's voice strained with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts immediately." As if mirroring the turmoil within her, the plane lurched violently. Sarah knew that she was in a fight for her life. The turbulence subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Sarah, forcing a reassuring smile onto her face, moved through the cabin, checking on passengers. But beneath the surface, her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. As she passed the first-class section, her eyes met those of one of the men. His gaze was cold, calculating, sending a shiver down her spine. Retreating to the galley, Sarah leaned against the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to act, had to find a way to expose these men. The hushed voices on the recording swirled around her, a cryptic message that held the key to unraveling the mystery. The package, they had said, the deadline, the plan. Sarah grabbed a notepad and a pen, her hand moving furiously as she transcribed the key phrases. Using the plane's Wi-Fi, Sarah accessed the internet, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she searched for any news. And then, she found it. It was all connected, and Sarah finally understood the danger they were all in. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on Sarah's shoulders. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that extended far beyond the confines of this plane. Time was running out. The plane was hurtling towards its destination, and with every passing moment, the danger grew more imminent. As she glanced towards the first-class section, she saw him again, one of the men, his face half hidden in the shadows. She had to think fast, had to find a way to outmaneuver her adversaries. Adrenaline surged through her veins, sharpening her senses, fueling her desperation. She had to get a message out, had to find a way to alert the authorities without arousing suspicion. Spotting a passenger engrossed in a magazine, an idea sparked in Sarah's mind. With trembling hands, she scribbled a note on a napkin. Flight 305 in danger. Contact authorities. Taking a deep breath, she slipped the note discreetly into the pages of the magazine. Now she could only wait, pray that the passenger would find the note and act before it was too late. The passenger, a businessman engrossed in an article about stock market trends, reached for his drink, his fingers inadvertently brushing against something hidden within the pages of the magazine. Frowning, he paused, his curiosity piqued. Carefully, he unfolded the napkin, his eyes widening as he scanned the hastily scribbled message. Flight 305 in danger, contact authorities. His gaze met Sarah's across the aisle, her face a mask of forced composure, but her eyes pleaded with him to understand. With trembling hands, the passenger reached for his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. The passenger hesitated, the weight of the situation heavy on his chest. Was this real? Was this a cruel joke? His heart pounded in his ears. He glanced at Sarah, her face a mask of composure, her eyes urging him to act. He took a deep breath, his finger finally pressing down on the button. The phone screen lit up, the words, "emergency call," flashing ominously. "I need to report a threat," he whispered into the phone. "On a plane. Flight 305, from New York to Los Angeles." The fate of the flight, her fate, rested on his shoulders. The man in the first-class cabin felt a prickle of unease. He couldn't place it, this sudden shift in the atmosphere. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if a storm was brewing. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the cabin, searching for the source of his discomfort. His gaze fell on the passenger, hunched over in his seat, whispering urgently into his phone. The man's jaw tightened. Something was wrong. He had been in this game long enough to trust his instincts. And his instincts were screaming at him that something was amiss. He caught the eye of his accomplice, a silent message passing between them. They had to be careful. Their plan was in motion, and any misstep could be disastrous. He would not allow anything or anyone to jeopardize their mission. Across the aisle, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen the exchange, the silent communication between the two men. They were on to them. Her attempt to alert the authorities had not gone unnoticed. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. She had just made a desperate situation infinitely worse. Sarah's mind raced, desperately seeking a solution. She had to find a way to stay one step ahead, to protect herself and the passengers. The game had changed, and the stakes were higher than ever. She was a fly caught in a spider web, the predators closing in. She ducked into the cramped bathroom, the lock clicking shut behind her. It offered little more than an illusion of privacy, but it would have to do. She needed a moment to think, to formulate a plan. The air hung heavy with the scent of stale perfume and fear. With trembling hands she pulled out her phone. She had to get a message out, had to let someone know what was happening. But who could she trust? Who would believe her? Her fingers flew across the keypad, composing a coded message, a desperate plea for help. She slipped back into the aisle, her composure regained, a plan beginning to form in her mind. She had to use her knowledge of the plane, her role as a flight attendant, to her advantage. She was surrounded by danger, but she was not powerless. She would fight back, for herself, and for the lives hanging in the balance. Going somewhere? The voice, laced with ice, stopped Sarah in her tracks. She turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs, to face the man from first class. He stood too close, his face a mask of controlled menace. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I don't think so," he snarled, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. "I think you've seen too much." But Sarah was ready for him. Years of dealing with unruly passengers with emergencies had honed her reflexes. She twisted out of his grasp, her elbow connecting sharply with his ribs. A gasp escaped his lips, surprise momentarily erasing the anger from his face. It was all the opportunity she needed. She shoved past him, her heart pounding in her chest, and raced down the aisle, the element of surprise on her side. She could hear him cursing behind her, the heavy thud of his footsteps echoing her own as he gave chase. The sudden commotion shattered the quiet hum of the cabin. Passengers looked up in alarm, their eyes wide with fear and confusion as Sarah sprinted down the aisle, the man hot on her heels. Thinking fast, Sarah grabbed a metal drinks cart, maneuvering it between herself and her pursuer. The cart slammed into him with a bone-jarring thud, momentarily slowing his advance. But she knew it wouldn't hold him for long. He was bigger, stronger, and fueled by a cold, ruthless determination. "Call the authorities!" she shouted, her voice ringing out over the gasps and murmurs of the stunned passengers. "He's dangerous! He's going to—" Her words were cut short as the man slammed into the cart again, the metal groaning under the force of his assault. And then, as if mirroring the chaos unfolding within its belly, the plane lurched violently, the turbulence returning with a vengeance. Passengers screamed, their bodies tossed about like rag dolls, as the plane bucked and shuddered around them. Sarah clung to the cart, her knuckles white, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it. This was where it all ended. The plane lurched violently again, tossing Sarah against the wall like a rag doll. Pain shot through her shoulder, but adrenaline masked the worst of it. The drinks cart, no longer a barrier, tumbled down the aisle, scattering cans and bottles like confetti. Passengers screamed, their terrified faces illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. Sarah struggled to her feet, her vision blurring. Where was he? The man who had been chasing her, had he been thrown clear? She had to get to the cockpit, warn the pilots, but her legs felt like lead. The plane bucked again, and this time the change was different, more severe. The nose dipped sharply, and a terrifying silence descended, replacing the engine's reassuring hum with a whistling void. They were falling. Panic clawed at her throat. She clung to a nearby seat, her knuckles white, her stomach churning. This wasn't air turbulence, this was something far worse, something deliberate. Her eyes darted to the faces around her, a tapestry of raw terror, and her heart ached. They were all going to die, weren't they? But amidst the chaos, Sarah saw him. The passenger. He was still on the phone, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of the screen. His expression was grim, determined. He met her gaze, a silent message passing between them. Hope. He was their only chance. Suddenly, the pain in her shoulder, the fear threatening to consume her, it all faded into the background. She had a purpose. She had to reach the cockpit. Ignoring the blood pounding in her ears, she began to crawl, pulling herself along the aisle, using the seats for leverage. The plane bucked and shuddered, the lights flickering erratically. Luggage tumbled from the overhead compartments, adding to the cacophony of noise and panic. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Lives were at stake and every second counted. The cockpit door was in sight now, tantalizingly close. Just a few more feet. She could hear the faint sound of voices raised in alarm and confusion coming from behind the closed door. One final surge of adrenaline and she reached out, her fingers closing around the cold metal handle. Inside the cockpit, chaos reigned. The captain fought desperately to regain control of the plummeting aircraft, his brow slick with sweat, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. The co-pilot, his face ashen, frantically ran through emergency checklists, his voice trembling as he relayed information. The door burst open, and Sarah stumbled in, her eyes wide, her chest heaving. "What's happening?" she gasped, her voice barely audible above the roar of the wind and the insistent blare of the alarm system. The co-pilot stared at her in disbelief, momentarily speechless. He had never seen such terror in someone's eyes before, yet she was here, in the cockpit, demanding answers. "They tampered with the plane," Sarah shouted, pointing back down the aisle towards where she had last seen the two men. "They're trying to crash it. The passenger, the one with the phone, he's calling the authorities." Section 4. The Passenger's Choice. Back in the cabin, the passenger clung to his phone, his knuckles white, his body tossed about like a rag doll as the plane continued its terrifying descent. The voice on the other end of the line, calm and reassuring, was a lifeline in the storm. "Sir, we're doing everything we can," the voice said, "but we need more information. Where are the men who tampered with the plane?" The passenger hesitated. He could hear a commotion coming from the cockpit now, raised voices, a struggle. They knew. Sarah had reached them. But what about him? What was his role in this nightmare? And then he saw them. The two men, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a chilling resolve, were making their way toward the cockpit. They were going to silence Sarah, silence him, before they could expose the truth. Fear warred with a strange sense of purpose within him. He was just an ordinary man, caught in an extraordinary situation. But in this moment, he held the key to saving everyone on board. He had to make a choice. Section 5. Descent into Darkness. The plane, no longer responding to the pilot's desperate attempts to right it, continued its descent into darkness. The ground, once a distant tapestry of fields and houses, was now a looming presence, rushing towards them with terrifying speed. Inside the cockpit, a desperate struggle raged. Sarah, fueled by adrenaline and fear, fought alongside the pilots, trying to subdue the two men who had hijacked their plane, their flight, their lives. But the men were bigger, stronger, and fueled by a cold, ruthless determination. The passenger, watching the scene unfold before him with a sickening sense of dread, knew that time was running out. He had to act, had to do something, anything to stop this madness. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath and made his choice. Section 1. Turning the tide. With a roar that belied his fear, the passenger launched himself across the aisle. He slammed into one of the men, his shoulder connecting with a sickening thud. The impact sent shockwaves through the cabin, momentarily distracting the other passengers from their own terror. The man, caught off guard, stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise. Inside the cramped cockpit, the fight continued. Sarah, utilizing every ounce of her strength and training, managed to land a well-aimed kick to the other man's stomach. He groaned, doubling over in pain, momentarily giving the captain a chance to wrestle free. The plane, responding to the captain's desperate adjustments, leveled out slightly, but the ground was still too close. The danger far from over. "They're in the cockpit!" the passenger shouted into the phone, his voice a mixture of fear and grim determination. "They're trying to crash the plane!" The voice on the other end of the line, calm and reassuring, acknowledged his words, a beacon of hope in the midst of the nightmare. "We're running out of time!" the co-pilot shouted, his voice tight with panic. The ground, a patchwork quilt of fields and buildings, was rushing towards them with terrifying speed. The captain, his face beaded with sweat, his jaw clenched in determination, fought to regain control of the aircraft, his every move a desperate gamble against fate. Section 2. Unveiling the Truth. As the plane descended, a beacon of hope emerged from the chaos. Flashing red and blue lights pierced through the cabin windows, casting an eerie glow on the terrified faces of the passengers. The wail of sirens reached their ears, a symphony of approaching salvation. They were going to make it. They were going to live. The landing was rough, the plane bouncing and skidding along the runway, but the captain, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, managed to bring Flight 305 to a stop. The cabin erupted in cheers and sobs of relief as the emergency slides deployed and passengers began to evacuate, eager to escape the confines of the aircraft that had become their prison in the sky. In the aftermath, as the authorities swarmed the plane and paramedics tended to the injured, Sarah found herself face to face with an FBI agent. Her body ached, her mind still reeling from the ordeal, but she knew that her role in this nightmare was far from over. With trembling hands, she handed him the recorder, the tiny device that held the key to unraveling the conspiracy, to bringing the perpetrators to justice. The story of Flight 305 became a media sensation, a tale of terror and courage, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. The world learned of the flight attendant who had risked everything to protect her passengers, the ordinary man who had found the courage to act in the face of unimaginable fear, and the pilots who had skillfully navigated their aircraft and its precious cargo through a storm of unimaginable proportions.